questions. So this is a paper about labor markets, in particular labor market risk, and it's joint work with Almut Balea, Susanne Forstner, and Johannes Gönsch. And this is a project that we've been working on for a while now, and I think we're at the stage where it would be very valuable to receive comments and feedback. So I'm very happy that I have the opportunity to present this here. And as I said, feel free to interrupt and give comments. It's highly appreciated. Okay, so let's get started. Well, as we know, the labor market is a risky place. Okay, people feel, they experience or they face different sources of risk on the labor market. So, for example, face employment risk or wage risk. And we know that this idiosyncratic risk that individuals they face on the labor market, it matters from an economic point of view. So it matters for certain aspects of individual decision making. Okay, so it matters, for example, for consumption savings decision, also for the job search behavior, portfolio choice, also human capital accumulation. And when we write down our models, then we usually assume that agents, they correctly assess the risk that they face in the labor market. So we usually assume that, say, the subjective probability distribution over different outcomes is identical to the actual probability distribution. So people do not know the exact future outcomes, but they know the distributions from which certain events are drawn. And our key empirical observation that we use to motivate what we do in the paper is that when you look at the data, especially at the labor market data for US, we see that the labor market risk that individuals perceive, it systematically differs from the actual risk. So we find that there's a substantial deviation between the subjective probability distribution and the actual probability distribution. I'm going to show you some data to be very precise and specific what I mean by that. And what we find, what I mean by this systematic deviation is that in the US, workers, they are vastly over-optimistic about their own labor market prospects. Okay, so this is not about expectations about aggregate variables, but it's expectations about individual labor market outcomes. And as we said, this labor market risk or idiosyncratic risk matters. So agents' expectations about their own labor market outcomes determines choices, individual choices. So therefore, if there's misperception in the risk, so if there's a bias in expectation, individual expectations, and if this bias is systematic, meaning that it doesn't cancel out across individuals, then it's also going to matter for aggregate outcomes. So by canceling out, I mean that it's not that when some people are perhaps overly optimistic, others are overly pessimistic, then the bias is kind of canceled out. But we find that this is not the case. It's systematic, and therefore we expect also aggregate outcomes to be affected by the bias in individual expectations. So that also gives rise to our main research question that we try to address in this paper, namely, what are the effects of agents' misperception of labor market risk on individual choices, but also on macroeconomic outcomes. We make two contributions in the paper. One is empirical, the other one is theoretical or quantitative. And in the empirical part, we take data, survey data, in order to quantify the bias in individual labor market expectations in the US economy. And we do this not only for, say, some average individual, but we slice the data and we consider different dimensions of heterogeneity to see whether this bias in expectations is perhaps more pronounced for certain demographic groups than for others. And certain dimensions of demographic characteristics turn out to be more important than others. In particular, the type of skill or the education that individuals have is a very strong, is a factor that matters very much for the degree of over-optimism of individual expectations. Then in the second part, we take the empirical findings of the first part and use it in a quantitative model. That is, we take a heterogeneous agent life cycle model that is in the spirit of, say, Bewley-Haggett-Ayagari model that has heterogeneous agent, that also has different sources of risk, of labor market risk, that has also incomplete markets. And here we allow the subjective probability distribution to differ from the actual one. Okay, so we do not adopt the usual assumption that people know the distributions, the true distributions, so they do not have rational expectations, but we use the probability distributions that we measure in the data that differ from the actual one. Then we calibrate it to the US economy, and we analyze via some counterfactual experiments to what extent this bias in expectations matters, and in particular matters for individual asset accumulation, but also life cycle paths of consumption, and also for aggregate outcomes like wealth inequality. Okay, and it turns out that aggregate wealth inequality is substantially affected by different degrees of this expectational bias in the underlying population. And in the last part, which is very much in progress, like the entire paper, but the last part is probably even more work in progress, we think about implications for economic policy. Okay, so if there's time at the end, I'm going to talk about this too. Now, literature. Literature on expectations is huge, okay? Especially about individual subjective expectations. So not about firm expectations, for example, but individual subjective expectations. And you can broadly categorize this literature into two parts. The first part, the literature analyzes expectation of individuals about aggregate outcomes. So for example, inflation, prices, unemployment rates, aggregate unemployment, stock market returns, and so on. So there's a lot of literature, and even people in this audience have worked on this quite substantially. And then in the second branch of the literature, individuals have analyzed expectations about individual outcomes, so individual income or individual survival or retirement, and also labor market prospects. And that's where our paper fits in. There is not a lot of literature on this yet, which is probably mostly due to data limitations, but now there's more and more data coming up, survey data on individual expectations, and that allows us also to analyze individual expectations about labor market outcomes. There is some work in the structural literature, for example, by Müller, who look at the behavior of unemployed individuals and their job search and asset accumulation behavior when they have biased beliefs. And there's also an empirical strand that is a little older, but it's not so old, but it goes back to the early 2000s, where empirical models are estimated to understand the causal relationship between subjective expectations about labor market outcomes and consumption decisions. Okay, very good. Let me show you a brief outline of the talk. We start with the data, talk about the facts or the empirical findings. We go to the model, set it up, we calibrate it, do a quantitative counterfactual analysis. If there's time, we do some policy analysis as well, and we conclude. Okay, facts. Let's go
Sorry,
to the data.
Jörg,
Yeah, yes,
can I ask you something? I'm
go
sure
ahead.
you're going to talk about this, but as I told you, I have to leave early, so I won't be
Sure.
able to ask afterwards.
Yeah.
If you find that people are over optimistic about their labor market processes, shouldn't that go against precautionary savings? So will
Hmm.
you have more trouble to reconcile the data with the model because of that?
Um, it's not a problem. So we're going to get the feature or the result, which we actually know from standard expected utility theory, that when people are optimistic or overly optimistic, then they save less than they would if they had rational expectations. So this basic principle is also underlying the main mechanisms in our paper. Now, when it comes to matching the data, we do not have a problem because we kind of find that this bias in expectations is a feature of the data. Okay, so we measure the data, we feed it in. Then the question is, to what extent can we, for example, match actual savings rates or marginal propensity to consume, but also aggregate wealth distribution. Now, the wealth distribution we match very well. I'm going to show this. We have not yet checked how we match the savings rates, for example, but also, for example, for different demographic groups. But since we match the wealth distribution very well, I would expect that also on the micro level, we can properly account for the savings behavior of individuals.
Okay, but usually you need extreme risk to match the Gini, right? Or
Yeah,
you need some shocks like health shocks or differences in the beta for different groups.
we don't need differences in the discount factor. Our shock structure is also not extreme. We measure it directly in the data. So we measure the actual labor income process in the data that we feed in the model. So there are no tricks required, so to speak, to match, for example, the very unequal distribution of wealth in the US economy.
I will need to check the recording afterwards to see
Yeah,
how you did. Thanks.
okay. Okay, the data. Let's look at some facts. Now, our data comes from the Survey of Consumer Expectations that's maintained or that's run by the New York Fed, and it has different modules, and we use the labor market module. And the Survey of Consumer Expectations, so the SCE, is a monthly survey. It's nationally representative. It's a rotating panel. It's not super small, but also not crazily large, but it has, say, 1,300 households per wave, so that over time gives rise to a reasonably sized data set. We use the waves from 2014 to 2018. The SCE is a relatively young survey, so it didn't start earlier than that. And there's some lag in the publication of data. So the most recent data is actually now, I think it's until 2019. So in fact, we have to update this. Now you might object, or you might notice that the period that we cover is a period of good times. It's a boom. There's no recession. So, I mean, this is somewhat of a, it's not a caveat, but it's something to keep in mind when we look at the results, that this is the facts that I'm going to show you is not generated from some super long run time series or series of data, but it's this 4 years window of data. And it might well be that in a recession, these patterns of expectational bias, they look differently. We are going to find out as more data is being released. And now since the COVID recession, we in fact have a recession in data. So future waves are going to show whether the results hold not only in a boom, but also in a recession. Now, as the name suggests, the SCE elicits subjective expectations about macroeconomic outcomes, but also about household level outcomes. And the particular question that we are interested in asks the respondents about their subjective probability of being in a given labor market state in 4 months. So the exact survey question is, what do you think is the percent chance that 4 months from now you will be either employed or unemployed and looking for work, and unemployed and not looking for work? Okay, so these are the answering options. And since active search is a distinguishing criteria, a distinguishing feature between unemployed people and people who are not in the labor force, we classify the second answer as the state of unemployment, and the third answer is the state of being not in the labor force. And the good thing is that the answer options that are given, they are mutually exclusive and also exhaustive. And in fact, for most of the respondents, we find that the probabilities that they give you, they add up to 100%. Only for very few, there's small deviations, and in fact, we exclude them. Now, the good thing is, as you have seen on the previous slide, that the SE relies on a probabilistic question format. So it's not that like in other surveys that people are asked about their qualitative expectations, whether something goes up or down. It's really a number that they give you, and these numbers can be aggregated using sample weights, and therefore we can consider we can compute the expectations for the average person, but also for different demographic groups. And our baseline sample is, say, the working age population. We also do some robustness here. We exclude people in the military and in school or college. And SE contains a lot of information also about demographic characteristics, so age, gender, etc., but also the current labor market state. So we can compute the subjective transition probabilities, say for employed people and for unemployed people and for people who are not in the labor force. So for example, we can compute the expected or the subjective transition probability of employed people to move into unemployment. That's what we have here. Now this is the average for the sample that we consider. So here we have in each column represents a given labor market state of the respondent. So sorry, not the column, the row. So the first row are the subjective expectations of people who are currently employed. And this is their expectation, say the 96.6% is their expectation to be employed in 4 months after the interview. Okay, so this is the expected transition probability. Now, this is interesting, but what's more interesting, at least for the purpose of our project, is how do these subjective probabilities compare to the actual transition probabilities. In order to compute these actual transition probabilities, we go to the CPS, which has a short panel dimension. We use the same time interval. We apply the same definitions of, say, labor market states, and also the same sample restrictions to achieve a high degree of consistency between the subjective and the actual sample. And here's the second column. We have the actual numbers, or the actual transition probabilities, and we compute also the deviation, the absolute deviation between the subjective and the actual. So let's look at those numbers, or a couple of those numbers, the ones which we think are most interesting. Now let's start with employed people. Now employed people, they expect to be employed in 4 months with a probability of 96.6, but in the data, in the actual data, it's slightly less, so there is a positive difference. So they employed individuals, they slightly overestimate the probability of remaining employed. Now this is a small number. It is statistically significant, so we can compute the bounds around this, but it's a relatively small number. And at the same time, they underestimate the likelihood of leaving the labor force. So they expect with a 1% probability of moving to move into non-employment or out of the labor force within 4 months, but in the data it's 3% or slightly more than 3%. So that's they underestimate exiting the labor force slightly. Now, more pronounced are the differences for the unemployed people. So they vastly overestimate the re-employment probability. They expect to be employed in 4 months with 56.2%, but in fact, in the data, it's only 41%. So there's a substantial gap in what they expect and also the outcome. And at the same time, they underestimate the probability of leaving the labor force. So it's about 14%. They expect to move out of the labor force, but in fact, it's 24%. So it's almost a 10 percentage point difference. And those who are not in the labor force, they overestimate the probability of entering the labor force, either through becoming employed directly or to start to search. Okay, so by and large, we can take away from this that individuals they tend to be over optimistic about their own labor market prospects. They tend to underestimate the likelihood of moving into a bad state, like from employment to non-employment, and also from unemployment to out of the labor force, and they overestimate the likelihood of moving into a good state, so finding employment or starting to look for a job. Now, this was the average, so we can of course slice the data and consider those biases and expectations for different demographic groups. So we do this, for example, with respect to gender, with respect to race. There are no systematic difference or no systematic patterns for those outcomes. So it's not that, for example, men they tend to be over optimistic and then women they are pessimistic or the other way. There are deviations, so they're not rational, obviously, but there are no systematic deviations. But there's one dimension for which we really find very pronounced differences, and that's by education. So we consider 3 education groups, namely those who have a high school degree or less, so we consider them as low skilled, and we have medium skilled individuals that have some college, and then we have a third category with college educated individuals and that also have more than a bachelor degree. And here I don't show you all the transition matrices, but only the difference between the subjective and the actual. So the first line is what we've seen on the previous slide. So for example, the 14.8 was let's go back, was the difference between the subjective and the actual probability of unemployed people to become employed. So these are 14.8. Now we can construct this difference for different education groups, and we see that the bias is actually largest for the low skilled, and it's still positive, but substantially smaller for the high skilled individuals. Okay, so there's this clear relationship with age, and the same holds also for other dimensions. So, for example, the likelihood or the probability of moving out of the labor force for employed people is on average, the bias is 2.1 or minus 2.1. And here again, the low skilled individuals, they are more over optimistic than the high skilled individuals. And the same holds, for example, also with respect to moving into the labor force for non-participants. Okay, so it seems that this degree of over-optimism is decreasing with education. Therefore, these high-skilled individuals, they seem to have a more precise perception of their labor market risk than low-skilled people. They're still over-optimistic, but they seem to have a substantially smaller bias. And this is also what's going to matter for aggregate wealth, or for the wealth inequality. Because when the low-skilled, when they are over-optimistic, through the results from expected utility theory, we know that they are going to save even less than they should under rational expectations. Also, the high-skilled people, they save less than under rational expectations, but only by a little bit. Okay, so this is exactly what gives you the reinforcement in the dispersion of aggregate wealth. Now we find a similar pattern for individual income than for education, but this is not surprising because income and education, they're highly correlated. Now, one thing we were interested in, still are interested, is whether there are certain patterns of learning in this data. So if, for example, there are is a relationship between these bias and, for example, age or job tenure or unemployment duration. Now we have started to analyze this. For example, with respect to age, there seems to be some pattern that some U-shaped pattern implying that the young, they are particularly they have a particularly strong bias. Then as people accumulate labor market experience, they seem to have more precise expectations. But then later on in later ages, there seems to be an increase in the bias again. However, as I said, the SE is a relatively young survey, so there's not so many observations yet. So therefore, the standard errors around this U-shape, for example, are relatively large, and therefore it's not a pattern that we would consider robust. And but it's something that we consider pursuing in the future. Now, given these empirical facts, we go to the yes.
Hello, Jorge here from the bank.
Hello.
Hi. So I recently came across to a paper by Scott Fulford, Fulford, and he uses the same data. This is a 2015 EER, and he concludes that income risk is not relevant for saving or asset accumulation. And he highlights another type of shocks in order that are motivating people to precautionary save. But your results are actually interesting and might help explaining his apparent result, because you find that the poorer people or less educated people, you think they might care more about that. Those are over optimistic. So it's more what you're finding potentially, right? That they don't really realize of the risk. So therefore, there is no apparent relationship, right? That might explain something along those lines that he finds. So just wanted to highlight that. Maybe I can send you the paper later, but I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Paper.
Yeah. And in fact, you touch upon a very interesting point that we plan to do, perhaps not in this paper, but in general, because what matters ultimately for individuals is not their expectation about their future labor market state, but their expectation about their future income. Now here we measure, given the data, the first part, namely the transit.
Yeah.
But what matters really for consumption savings is the income part. Now in fact, it's very hard to get consistent data on individual income expectations. There's surveys about household expectations or total income, so not related to labor market risks. But again, it's not consistent. Also, the measurement and the comparison between subjective and actual is very hard. So in fact, we've been thinking about how to obtain such data, and also, for example, how to run surveys. So they're very recent tools that allow you to create such surveys yourself in order to obtain such data, to generate such data, because that would be, say, the ultimate test of the model. Okay, because here we have only one source of expectational bias, but I mean there might be more related to the actual income process. Yeah. And such data would be important to like disentangle different sources of the bias, whether it's labor market risk, like the transition risk, or it's, say, really the income risk that matters. Yeah. But if you could send me the paper, it would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Hi. This is Andres Fernandez from the bank.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Great. I have a couple of questions or overall remarks. Is this over optimism intrinsic to the labor market, or has the literature documented this in other contexts? That's one thing. And then more to the point you're making or the results, should we view this as agents not being Bayesian? So are they observing what is going on in the labor market, and they simply don't update their priors, or instead they're not looking at them because of some informational friction that gets relaxed with education? I'd like to know your take on this.
Okay. So the first part, whether this labor market optimism is also extends to other fields. In fact, for the US, we're checking whether we find similar patterns, say, for example, with respect to individual survival. It's also an important outcome, and there was surveys that tried to elicit those expectations. So the question would be whether this is something US specific, because we have also analyzed data on Germany, expectation data for Germany, and there we find the opposite. So Germans, or at least employed Germans, they are overly pessimistic about their labor market prospects. And in fact, that's how we started the whole project, because I mean, there are all these stereotypes about different cultures. And I mean, the Germans, they are known to be very cautious about stuff. In fact, when you look at the data, you see that they're overly insured when it comes to different insurances. They buy a lot of insurance that in fact are not necessary given the event probabilities. So this notion of German Angst, which in fact is known also in the literature, this seems to be reflected also in the labor market expectation data. So labor market over-optimism, the one that we measure here, is perhaps only specific to the US. Okay, so this is, say, reflecting American dream. Everything is possible. Okay, you think that there are no boundaries. I mean, I'm stretching it now, but I mean, this kind of is also reflected in stereotypes that we have across countries. So it's not that individuals across the globe, they are over optimistic about the labor market prospects itself. So, but this seems to be something that is country specific. About the second question, whether people are Bayesian. So the work by Müller, which is about expectations of unemployed people, shows that as people stay unemployed, the bias in their expectation, their over-optimism bias in their expectation does not diminish over time. So they seem to be not updating in the way that they should be. Okay, they are over-optimistic and they remain over-optimistic. Now, in their analysis, they use different data. We want to use the SCE in the future when, again, more data is coming up to analyze such patterns, perhaps learning patterns also for employed people, that when you're in the job, you accumulate tenure and you learn about, say, your own productivity, the match productivity, and we want to analyze how that affects individual expectations about separation. So the aspect of learning is going to be a very interesting one, and we don't tackle it in this paper because of the data limitations, but it's certainly something that that should be analyzed. Not in the context of this paper, but in the future, certainly that would be very interesting. Okay.
Thank you.
Unless there are other questions, I would move on to the quantitative analysis in the paper. And here, what we do is...
Sorry, I have a question. Maybe I should wait for the model, but at the end, if you find that this correlates with education, then how can we know that this is that the the effect on wealth inequality will be due to this and not due to the fact that the poor or the less educated are less sophisticated in investing their savings, and then they have access to low returns, or that they're transferred from the government that make that the unemployment is not so bad for them. I mean, we would like to see if this is quantitatively important, right? But then we need to take into account that it is correlated with many features that have been analyzed before in this type of models.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me postpone my answer to after we've seen the model and also the quantitative analysis, and perhaps we can discuss it then, because I mean the quantitative magnitude of our channel, of course, is something that, or the robustness of that, is certainly something that should be carefully analyzed. Okay, so in the quantitative part, we ask to what extent this bias in individual expectations matters for individual decision making, but also for aggregate outcomes like wealth inequality. And the focus in this paper is on the consumption savings decision of the individual, so wealth accumulation over the life cycle and the implications for aggregate wealth inequality. Now, obviously, this is not the only decision or the only dimension of decision making that is potentially affected by this bias. So therefore, in a companion paper, we focus on the labor market related aspects. So the labor market related decisions with respect to, for example, job search, wage bargaining, but also quit behavior. Okay, so this is it. Our focus in this paper is not because we think that this is the only dimension for which this bias matters, but we also have a related work where we follow up on this and also look at different aspects of decision making. Now the model is actually a relatively standard model. It builds on Bewley, Haggett, Ayagari. It has many features from the handbook chapter of Krüger, Mittman, Perry. It adds some additional ingredients to the baseline model. So we allow agents to have different levels of human capital just to be able to match this heterogeneity in the data across different skill groups. We also add a state of being out of the labor force. Usually labor market models, they consider employment, unemployment, but we also consider out of the labor force as a certain state, as a different state. And importantly, we add subjective expectations. So we allow the subjective transition probability matrix to differ from the actual one. We don't incorporate learning, and there's also no aggregate fluctuations in the model. So it's a stationary model. And as we know, a key implication in this class of model is that agents accumulate savings for precautionary motives, so to self-insure, but also to save for retirement, for example. Now it's a life cycle model. It's a rather rudimentary life cycle. We say that individuals can be either in working age or in retirement. So working age is denoted by W and retirement is denoted by R. And there's stochastic aging. So with a certain probability, working age individuals, they retire. And with a certain probability, retired individuals, they pass away and they are replaced by newborn individuals. So we can compute directly the population shares of retired individuals and of working age individuals. Preferences are CRA over consumption. Individuals can save in assets, and there's some non-state contingent return R. Individuals are born without assets, and there's a boring limit, a lower bar that applies to individual decision making. Now, human capital is modeled as follows: individuals, they are ex ante heterogeneous with respect to their stock of human capital, and we consider 3 levels of human capital, namely low skill, medium skill, and high skill. And when individuals, when they're born, they draw their level of human capital from some stationary distribution, and it's assumed to remain constant over time. So there's no skill accumulation here, and also there's no educational choice, just to keep things tractable. Now about the labor market, we consider 3 different states of the labor market. People can be employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. And the transitions between these states, they are governed by a Markov process. So there's a transition probability that differs across workers with human capital. So this transition probability PH is the probability for a human capital level H, and that gives the probability that individuals, they move from state S to S prime. And well, as I said, we allow these transition probabilities to differ between levels of human capital. This is an important feature because also in the data we see that the transition probabilities, they differ across skill groups. And also importantly, we consider 3 labor market states instead of 2. This is also something which adds not only descriptive realism to the model, but it's important for the model to match the data, which also, especially with respect to the expectational data, which is also for these 3 states. Then in addition, we follow the Krüger-Mittman-Perry approach, and we add stochastic idiosyncratic labor productivity. Okay, so individuals, they have labor, they're characterized by their idiosyncratic labor productivity, and this is also assumed to follow a first order Markov process, and there are some transition probabilities, P, H, therefore they're also human capital specific. So the high skill individuals, they have different transition probability than low skill individuals. And Krüger-Mittman-Perry show that this additional source of randomness, namely the labor productivity, is very important, as an important feature to match, for example, the observed wealth distribution. So without it, the wealth distribution that the model generates is not as dispersed as the one that we see in the data. Now, this additional source of risk, obviously, or this labor productivity, which is stochastic, adds an additional source of labor market risk. In our case, the labor market risk consists namely of these 2 components, namely the employment risk or the transition probability risk, so that people transit between different states of the labor market, and this productivity risk, which is denoted by C and captures labor productivity. Now, production is relatively boring as usual in this class of models, with a representative firm, rents capital and hires labor and produces according to a Cobb-Douglas, with competitive markets, which gives rise to marginal product pricing. Now, there's a government that runs 3 different programs. It runs an unemployment insurance program that pays unemployment benefits to people who are in the state of unemployment. It also pays welfare benefits to those who are in a state of non-employment or out of the labor force. And it provides social security benefits to retirees. In order to finance those programs, the government levies taxes on labor income and also runs a balanced budget every period. Now let's start with the mechanics of the model, in particular with the optimization problem. The ones for the retirees, which is on this slide, is relatively boring because retirees, they don't do much. And they are also not subject to risk. The state that characterizes a retiree is given by the level of assets A and the level of human capital H. How the retiree chooses consumption and next period assets to solve the Bellman equation, which consists of the instantaneous return and also the continuation value. And the continuation value here is pre-multiplied with the effective discount factor, which is not only the discount rate beta, but also the probability of survival until next period. Then the budget constraint of the retiree has consumption next period assets on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have social security payments provided by the government, and we have the return on asset holdings on the right-hand side. And we assume, following again Krüger, Mittman, Perry, that retirees, they have access to perfect annuity markets, which means that the assets of those who leave the economy, those who pass away, they are used to pay an extra return to the retired survivors. So this is a fairly elegant way in order to distribute the assets of those who leave the economy. Now, slightly more interesting is the optimization problem of working age individuals. Now, they are characterized also by their assets A, by the level of human capital H, by their labor market state S. This can be employed, unemployed, out of the labor force, and their current level of labor productivity. Now, they also choose between consumption savings, and they maximize they solve the Bellman equation, which again consists of the instantaneous return. And then there's the continuation value. Now, the continuation value, the second part of which takes into account the probability that the working age individual retires and moves into the state of retirement, and therefore obtains the payoff of retirement, which is WR. But if the working age individual does not retire, then between today and tomorrow, several things can happen. So with a certain probability that the productivity state C can change, and this is governed by the Markov process PH. But the individual also can change the labor market state. So for example, an employed individual can become unemployed or move out of the labor force. Now, and this is governed differently from the baseline model by the subjective transition probability, because the Bellman equation, or the expected value that is incorporated in the Bellman equation, this is computed on the basis of the subjective probability. So this is the key difference to the standard model, that we incorporate here the subjective probability of switching the labor market state. Now, the budget constraint is also relatively standard. Y is income, and Y depends on the actual labor market state. So the employed people, they get a wage per unit of effective labor. And this effective labor is given by the human capital level of the individual and the current level of labor productivity. There are taxes, labor income taxes and social security taxes that employed people have to pay. And also unemployed people, they have to pay a labor income tax. They are exempt from the social security tax, just like in US data, but they get unemployment benefits from the government. And individuals who are not in the labor force, they get some welfare benefits T from the government. Now we can define the recursive competitive equilibrium, which is relatively, this is really standard. There's just one little detail that one should keep in mind, also for computational reasons, that we assume a so-called, or what we call, a veil of ignorance. So individuals in the model, they have an incomplete model of the macroeconomy. Okay, so they do not know the equilibrium mapping between the primitives and the aggregate state of the economy. If they knew that, then they could infer that they actually make a mistake or they have a bias in their expectations, because they would see that the aggregate prices do not move in the same way, or they're not determined by the underlying aggregate states in the way that they think they are determined. Okay, so this veil of ignorance is basically introduced in order to break the link between rational expectations and subjective expectations. Now, the quantitative analysis consists of several steps. In the first part, we calibrate the model to US data. We report quantitative properties of the model and compare to the data just to get a feeling whether the quantitative model is actually reasonable. Okay, so whether it can reasonably match aspects in the data which we consider as important. And we run experiments in order to understand what effect the bias in expectation has for individual but also aggregate outcomes. And we build intuition for that using a partial equilibrium analysis. And then we move on in the fourth step to general equilibrium analysis to see what the bias in expectation does in general equilibrium. Okay, the calibration. The model is not super simple, but also not overly complex. I mean, it has these different layers, a life cycle and so on, but to calibrate it, it's actually very easy because it's only very few parameters which you have to calibrate internally. Most of them you can read off directly from the data. So for example, we estimate the labor income process in the data for different levels of human capital using PSID data in order to determine the Markov process that governs the transitions of individual labor productivity. So this follows also a tradition in this literature that you estimate the labor income process. Here we do it separately for different education groups because we allowed the labor productivity to be governed by human capital specific processes, but you can estimate this ex ante in the data and then feed it indirectly into the model. Also other variables, parameters like probability of retiring, of dying, these are also easy to calibrate given targets in the data like work life of 40 years, retirement of 15 years, calibrate the capital share, the interest rate, and also we measure the unemployment benefits and also the retirement benefits and welfare benefits directly in the data, and we back out the underlying replacement rates in the model. Then in the first step, you want to know whether what the computer spits out is actually reasonable, or what the calibration that you put in is actually reasonable given some non-targeted moments or non-targeted observations in the data. And we do this with respect to different dimensions. And here I show you the wealth holdings, individual wealth holdings over the life cycle, but also the individual income over the life cycle. And I show this here for the different levels of skill and compare the data outcome, which is the solid line in each of the panels, with the model implication. And we see that, for example, the average individual wealth holdings for different skill groups that the model predicts are actually very closely in line with those that we see in the data. So we see that, for example, for all the different skill groups, people accumulate wealth over the life cycle, but this increase in wealth is relatively moderate for low-skilled people and very pronounced for high-skilled people. So we match not only the slope, but also the intercepts or the differences across the different skill groups, even though in the calibration we did not target any of those observations. We can compute the distribution of wealth and compare it with the distribution in the US data. Here in this column we have the data outcome, and the model actually does a very good job in matching the feature in the data that the first 2 quintiles, so the first 40% of the poorest 40% of the US population, they basically hold no wealth. Okay, so the wealth holdings in the model, they are positive, but they are very, very small compared to what the richer people they hold. Also, the Gini coefficient is relatively close to what we see in the data. So even though, for example, at the very top, the model doesn't do a good job, but it's not designed to, for example, have superstars or really high earners. But the average, it matches very well, or the average dispersion, so to speak. Okay, now, what does the bias do in the model? So how does the difference between the actual and the perceived risk, how does it really affect individual decision making? And in order to gain intuition on this, we're going to take a partial equilibrium approach where we fix prices and taxes at the equilibrium values, and we report optimal policy functions, or optimal savings decisions or asset accumulation decisions for different types of individuals. So this is the policy function for asset holdings for a high-skilled individual that we have given the correct beliefs. Okay, so this is actually what the model gives you if you consider a high-skilled individual that is employed and you equip this high-skilled individual with correct beliefs. It's increasing, which makes sense because richer people, they also save more. So on the x-axis we have the current asset holdings, on the y-axis we have tomorrow's asset holdings. Now we compare the policy function of the high-skilled individual with the policy function of the low-skilled individual for the same level of assets. Now, the low-skilled individuals, they face more risk. They face more actual risk, okay? Because their transition probabilities, their actual transition probabilities are such that they transit, for example, more often into non-employment, also from employment more into unemployment. So for the same level of assets, they should save more than the high-skilled guy because they live a riskier life. And that's in fact what the model spits out, not surprisingly. Okay, so they save more because they live a riskier life and therefore they accumulate more precautionary savings. Now we've seen in empirical part that the high-skilled guy is over-optimistic. Okay, so in terms of the policy function, that means that the high-skilled guy saves less for every level of assets. The high-skilled guy with the bias, the over-optimistic high-skilled guy, saves less than the high-skilled guy with rational expectations. Okay, but we've seen at the beginning in the empirical part that the low-skilled guy, who is also over-optimistic, is even more over-optimistic than the high-skilled guy. So when you look at the policy function of this guy, who is more over-optimistic, and we see that the low-skilled guy, who is more over-optimistic, saves even less than the over-optimistic high-skilled guy. So this means that the individuals who should save the most, namely the low-skilled individual, because they face most of the risk, they should, given the data, they should actually they are going to save the least in the model, and that's also what gives you the dispersion in wealth, because those who should save the most, in fact, they should save the least because they're overly optimistic. Okay, very good. Now, what are the effects in general equilibrium? Okay, so what happens when we also allow prices and quantities to aggregate quantities to adjust? Now, in order to understand the quantitative effect of this bias in expectations, we run an experiment where we shut down all the bias, all the misperception, and we equip individuals with the correct beliefs about their labor market risk. So we give them rational expectations. And our question here is, how would the equilibrium look like if agents had the correct beliefs? And importantly, in this in this exercise, we do not recalibrate any parameters, but we keep them as they are in the baseline case. Okay, we're just shutting down the bias in expectations. And of course, that does something to individual decision making. It does something, first of all, to the savings behavior. Now here I report the savings rate in the baseline case where we have the bias in expectations for different types for different labor market states. So for the employed people, for the unemployed people, and for the non-employed. Now in the baseline case, the employed people, they save the most. Unemployed people, they also save, but already a little less. And people who are not in the labor force, they decumulate assets. I mean, this is in line with consumption smoothing. When you're out of the labor force, you have no labor income, so therefore you decumulate assets to maintain a path of consumption. Now, when you shut down the bias in expectations and give everyone the correct expectations, then people are going to save more, because when you shut down their over-optimism, they save more. They realize that they're in a riskier world, and therefore the employed guy, they save more. The unemployed guy saves more, and the out of the labor force guy, they decumulate the assets not as fast as they would if they were over-optimistic about future employment. Now, when you split this into different education groups, you see that the adjustment is highest for the low-skill individuals. Okay, so for example, the employed low-skill individuals, they increase their savings rate from 39% to 45%, because for them, the bias in expectation was highest, so therefore the adjustment in their savings behavior is also the highest. Okay, and so the main result is that when they correctly assess the risk that they face, they accumulate more savings in good states, and they decumulate the assets in the bad states at a slower pace, and the effect are largest for those individuals, the low-skilled individuals who had the highest degree of over-optimism. Now, what does this do to aggregate wealth inequality? Now, when people save more, they accumulate more assets, so there's going to be a higher capital stock in the economy. They all accumulate more assets. Also, and especially the low-skilled individuals. That's reflected here in the first two quintiles, because the low-skilled individuals, they're more likely to be in the lower quintiles. So therefore, we see a higher asset accumulation among the poor people, and this squeezes the wealth inequality. So this higher asset accumulation, especially by low-skilled, implies that wealth inequality, or the Gini coefficient representing the wealth inequality, shrinks quite a lot to 0.67. So this means that, according to these results, a large part of the wealth inequality that we observe in the US data is actually due to the bias in individual expectations. If individuals had the correct expectations and therefore save more, then the wealth inequality that we would observe is substantially less. There are also additional general equilibrium effects via higher wages and lower interest rates. So when individuals, when they save more, there's more capital in the economy, so therefore the wage per unit of labor increases, which is beneficial mostly for low-skilled individuals, because for them, a larger part of their income is due to labor income. Okay, very good. Now, when people accumulate more assets, then of course they can better self-insure against income fluctuations. Okay, when they have more precautionary savings, then shocks in their individual income can be better smoothed out. And this is also something that we can actually measure. So we can measure the degree of consumption smoothing in the baseline case with the effect of biased expectations and in the counterfactual economy. So on the individual level, we estimate an equation that relates the change in individual consumption between periods to the change in individual income. And the coefficient B here tells us to what extent individuals are able to smooth their level of consumption, or in other words, whether they can insure, or how well they can insure against fluctuations in income. Now we estimate this separately for different skill groups, and we find that, for example, in the baseline case, the low skill individuals, they're much more exposed to income fluctuations than the high skill guys. So their stream of consumption is more volatile than the stream of consumption of the high skilled guys. Now, when you shut down the bias, people accumulate more assets. They are better able to smooth consumption. It is also reflected by the estimated coefficient of beta, which shrinks for all education groups, but most importantly for the low skill individuals. Now, what about welfare? Now, would the optimist be better off being a realist? Okay, so what happens to welfare when we reduce, or when we eliminate the bias and expectations? Now, in order to obtain the welfare effects, we compute the equivalent variation in expected lifetime consumption for individuals, of newborn individuals with different skill levels. So we compare, or we compute the level of phi that, or the additional to consumption that you have to give to a newborn individual, to the future stream of consumption, to make him or her as well off as in the economy without the bias and expectation. Okay, so we ask how much do you have to add to the stream of consumption in terms of lifetime consumption to make the two worlds look equally attractive to the individual. Now, of course, an important question is, how do you compute the expected value here? Do you compute the expected value using the true transition probabilities or the subjective transition probabilities? Now, the welfare results crucially depend on this, because when you compute the expected value with the actual transition probabilities, then agents are going to gain, because they are better off in the economy without misperception, because they accumulate more assets, they are better able to smooth their consumption, and therefore, and also they're able to maintain a higher level of lifetime consumption, or to attain a higher level of lifetime consumption. So they would all gain, in particular the low-skilled individual, for which we obtain welfare effects of around 10% of lifetime consumption. For the high-skilled guy, there's also 3%. But what happens if you ask them, if you ask the over-optimist if they want to move to the other world? So you basically compute the expected lifetime, or the equivalent variation expected lifetime consumption, using the perceived lifetime consumption. So when we compute the expected value using the subjective transition probabilities, then nobody would like to move, because I mean, they live in their world, so to speak, and if you offer them to move to another world, which is much more risky, then of course they would be totally against it. Okay, so the the welfare effects are hugely negative if you compute them with the perceived expected value, or the subjective expected value. Okay, very good. Now, okay, we did 1 hour away. We have a little bit of time to talk about policy, but there's just a few remarks from my side on the extent of policy, because in fact this is very preliminary. So these are just some thoughts about where to go from here and whether there's something interesting that one could pursue and analyze from the viewpoint of policy. Now, the starting point of these considerations is the result that agents, they save too little, and when they have a bias in expectations, and they're overly exposed to income fluctuations. Now, we've seen that this is particularly true for low-skill individuals who are asset poor. So in order to help them, in the sense that in order to increase their welfare, you would need instruments that provides incentives to accumulate savings. Because if, for example, you would just increase public transfers, if you would just increase the benefits that the government pays to unemployed people or to welfare recipients or to retired people, then this would not help to mitigate that effect, because it would just crowd out private savings. So an effective policy would be required which stimulates individual savings. And such a policy could be welfare enhancing. So that could be, for example, a savings subsidy, either flat or actually conditional on the degree of misperception of the bias and expectation. Or we could also think about, say, that the optimal level of the subsidy, namely the level of the subsidy that is required to exactly offset the disincentive in savings that is induced by the bias and expectations. Okay, so these are certain thoughts that follow from the results that the model generates, but this is, as I said, really some exploratory look only, without having done the analysis yet. Okay, this brings me to the conclusion of the paper. Now, in this paper, we use survey data on individual expectations for the US labor market, and we quantify the bias in individual expectations that people have about future labor market transitions. The main empirical finding is that in the US, workers or individuals, they're vastly over-optimistic, especially the low-skill individuals. They're over-optimistic about their future labor market prospects. So they expect good things to happen with a higher probability than is actually the case, and they expect bad things to happen with a lower probability than is actually the case. And we put this finding into, or we evaluate the economic importance of this bias using a general equilibrium model with heterogeneous agents, and we allow there the subjective transition probabilities to differ from the actual transition probabilities, and we find that this over-optimism has very strong effects on the individual level in terms of asset accumulation, and also leads, due to a lack in precautionary savings, to a higher exposure of individuals to income fluctuations. This effect is very strong for low-skill individuals, so therefore on the aggregate level, we find a strong effect of this bias on the level of wealth inequality. So we find that in the data, the level of wealth inequality that is induced by the bias in expectations is actually very high. And it reduces welfare because people are overly exposed to income fluctuations, and they're also not able to attain a level of lifetime consumption that they would obtain if they had correct expectations. And as a thought for future research, we think it might be interesting to look at policies that help to stimulate private savings, because they are potentially welfare enhancing given the results that we obtain. Now, from a broader viewpoint, this paper is part of a larger research agenda that we pursue, and that we also extend to, for example, other countries, but also other aspects of decision making. So first of all, we are in the process of gathering additional empirical findings about US over-optimism using other data sources. So for example, the Survey of Economic Expectations has information on this, but also the Health and Retirement Study has information about expectations of older individuals. In the PSID, there was also a wave where individuals were asked about the expectations. So following up on one of the first questions in this talk, we're trying to see whether the over-optimism that we find with respect to labor markets is also present with respect to other dimensions. importantly, what we also want to do is an empirical model validation using subjective expectations about income growth, because as we said, what matters for utility is income, or for the consumption savings choice is expectations about future income, not about future labor market states. Future labor market states, they determine future income, but what ultimately counts is how much people make in future periods, or how much they expect to make in the future. So therefore, it would be interesting to obtain data that allows us to really validate that prediction of the model. And in the companion paper, as I said, we also look at labor market effects of bias in expectations, and we analyze the effects of a bias in expectations on labor market related choices like bargaining or wages, search behavior, but also quit behavior. And since such expectation data exists also for Germany, we are doing a cross-country study where we compare what I called first the German Angst, so the pessimism about future events versus the American dream, which is reflected by the degree of over-optimism that we analyze in this paper. Okay, thanks a lot. That's all I wanted to say, and I'm very happy to receive comments and feedback on this. And if you have questions, just feel free to ask them now. I will stop sharing the screen so that I can see some faces, because I was talking to my monitor over the last 1.5 years for teaching and so on. So I'm happy to see some real faces now.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Jorge again. So what I'm thinking is that some components of consumptions are not easy to adjust, especially for the low-skilled people, right? So if you receive the realization of labor market risk or unemployment, you will move out of the house, or you won't simply stop eating, right? So can you see in the data actually the predicted adjustment on liquid assets is consistent with what you see? I know that it's short, but because this could lead to the conclusion that other factors might be there, right? Like minimum consumption thresholds, or even heterogeneity in the betas, as Sophia was mentioning. Have you done that?
So the US data does not allow us to check this, because with respect to choices, there is limited information in the survey of consumer expectations. In the German data, we can actually do that because the German data comes from a panel data set from the German socioeconomic panel that started in the 1980s and followed families or households over a long period of time and asked these expectational questions on a regular basis. And in addition, also recorded economic outcomes at the individual and at the household level. And among these economic outcomes are, for example, also consumption choices, asset choices, I think also purchases of consumer durables, of real estate. So in fact, in the context of the Germany paper, this is one aspect that we could check. For example, whether there's some portfolio adjustments. And we have at the very start of this with the German data, but we have already checked empirical relationships between degrees of biases in expectation. And the effects that we find for the US, they are empirically confirmed in the German data. So for example, in German data, we find that people who are overly optimistic, they also have a lower savings rate. Or with respect to labor market outcomes, we find that people who are over optimistic, they also get a higher wage. Now, when you think in terms of, say, a Mortensen-Pissarides model with Nash bargaining, that's exactly what you get. Because when you sit down with your firm as a worker, and you're very optimistic about the future, about the continuation value of the match, then you will be able in this bargain to extract a larger share of the surplus. So this is something that we find empirically there. Yeah.
But
then just go ahead.
Yeah, because you mentioned the German data would support that, but the fact that the levels are consistent doesn't necessarily mean, because you could save less because you are low skill over optimistic, but because you have a lot of consumption to do, basically.
Yeah.
So right. So it's not over optimistic. It's like you need to eat, you need to live in the house. So the change in consumption, the change in asset would kind of validate that.
Indeed, yes. Now, it brings me back to the first question. I think Sophia asked that about other dimensions or other aspects that give rise to wealth heterogeneity. Now, in order to consistently answer that, we would have to run a horse race using the model where we consider also other driving forces like discount factor heterogeneity, consumption, so subsistence consumption, so things also across skill levels that that drive different savings behavior. That's true, yes. In fact, the way the model is calibrated currently, those factors, they appear as part of the labor productivity process, because that's the, say, the catch-all process that captures all sources of income variation that is not part of the labor market transition. Yeah. But I mean, as to be fully transparent on this, one would have to split up this process into different factors like discount factor heterogeneity. Yeah.
Hi, George. I wanted to ask more about your empirical result that American workers are over-optimistic. So this survey of the New York Fed, it is done online, right? So it can be biased a bit in the sample. I wonder if you would control for heterogeneity, meaning the occupation and the education of the people that are surveyed, perhaps the optimistic bias would be smaller. And that leads me to the same question that you posed at the end, whether this is replicated for other countries. Because I know I find that, well, at least outside of the United States, people are very pessimistic about certain outcomes, right? People believe the probability of events like suffering a crime is very big, and people think, oh, the probability that they would get into unemployment is extremely high, which is sort of not based on the data.
Yeah. So with respect to your first question, whether the sample that is surveyed by the SE is like a particular sample. Now, this is a crucial point, whether the sample from which we get the expectations is comparable to the sample from which we compute the actual transition probabilities. If we're comparing apples and oranges, then the difference that we compute is meaningless. Now, we think we do a good job in controlling for observables to make sure that both samples, they are comparable in terms of characteristics. We also use, for example, the weighting factors from the CPS to aggregate the SAE observations. And ultimately, what we also do is, since the SAE has a short panel dimension, we also compute the actual transition probabilities using the SCE. So this is now exactly the same sample, the same individuals. And we get qualitatively the same results. Quantitatively, there are some differences, but qualitatively, we get the same results. But we use the CPS because it just has a much larger sample size, and we think it's a representative result about the actual transition probabilities. Now, about the second question, whether the Americans, whether they are different, or whether they are the only ones who think that that bad things can't happen, or whether they are over-optimistic. That's why we are at the process now of digging deeper and looking also at other expectational data. So data and expectations about other outcomes within the US, whether to see, first of all, whether labor market related expectations are different from expectations about other stuff, crime, income, house prices, etc. And the cross-country study that we do is also meant to see whether there are certain cross-country differences. I know of data for the UK where also unemployed individuals, only unemployed individuals, were surveyed, and there also it turns out that they have an optimistic bias. So also in the UK, they seem to be much more positive about the labor market prospects.
I was also thinking that another issue that could lead some bias for the New York Fed survey is that it is relatively recent.
Yes.
So it is, and you know that lots of people say it's hard to test rational expectations because there are aggregate shocks.
Yeah.
And well,
But
if
this
you
is
don't have a large sample, and I mean, you just think about it. So this generation was scarred by the subprime crisis. So from 2007 until 2010, they had high unemployment. So maybe people started 2014. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a very valid point. So as I said at the beginning, we study this period because the data is just on this period. We can't extend it, and therefore the results have to be taken with a grain of salt. They reflect good times in general. So it might well be that this over-optimism in the data vanishes or perhaps even reverts when the economy goes into recession. Now, the next waves of the SCE that will be published soon, which already cover the COVID recession, are going to show whether this over-optimism is in fact a robust feature or whether it only applies to good times of the aggregate economy. Yeah.
Hi, this is Mario from the bank too. I have a question regarding on the horizon of the over-optimistic bias that you find. Because if I understand correctly from your presentation, the question that you study relates to a situation that's 4 months in the future, right?
Yes.
So do you have an idea if this over-optimistic also, maybe not for the US because you said that the sample is short, holds for longer horizons, for like, for example, 5 years? And what the effect would be for this in precautionary savings or in fact for the savings in terms of the longer savings like pensions, something like that.
So the SCE also has a question about the longer horizon. I think it is a year, also about the labor market expectations on a 12 months frequency. It is not directly comparable to the 4 months question because the states that are asked are different. Also, the sample of individuals that are asked are different. But what can be seen is that the 4 months probabilities, when you compound them to an annual frequency, then you do not get what people tell you at the 12 months frequency. So they think about the 12 months differently than they think about the 4 months. So this might be some cognitive bias perhaps, but it implies that it's not a linear extrapolation from the 4 months frequency to the 12 months frequency. We don't have data for other countries or for a sample where you can really compare the different horizons. So I can't give you a definite answer on this one. But it seems from this rough results, it seems that the horizon really matters for the bias in expectation, or at least for the quantitative dimension of the bias.